process of meiosis to form sperm, spermatogenesis. And it happens inside of testes in a tube system called seminiferous tubules. And this is where I left off, the anatomy of the male. And this is from the anterior part. And so, and we look just like the fetal pigs. Okay, they're there too. Except for right now, the fetal pigs, the penis is internal, it's not external. Scrotum is still outside. So scrotum is a sac in which the testes happen to be in. This is where the seminiferous tubules happens to be. And so during ejaculation, where the sperm would move, it's stored in the epididymis, okay? And it is propelled out by muscle contractions, not by swimming sperm. The sperm does not, the flagellum is not activated until sperm is deposited in the female. Okay, and I'll talk about that momentarily, but it's from the epididymis through the vas deferens, ejaculatory duct, into the urethra. Okay, and that's the pathway that it goes. All right, so male accessory glands. I pointed them out. In fact, let's go back here and look at them again, especially from the sides. You know where they're at. Below the bladder is the prostate. Okay, so the urethra goes through the prostate. Okay, however, and the prostate, it has openings into the urethra, so that puts some of its secretions there. Right behind it are a pair of seminal vesicles, and then at the base of the penis, still internal, is the bulbourethral gland. These are three male accessory glands. And what do they do? Okay, for one, they add secretions to the semen or the sperm. And so really what's ejaculated is called semen. Semen and sperm are not synonymous, okay, technically. Okay, they're not the same thing. Sperm is just the gametes, okay, cells with the flagellum, whereas the semen is the sperm plus all the secretions, all right? And so what the seminal vesicles produce, they produce amino acids and fructose, and that is an energy source for the sperm, because once it is deposited in the female, then the flagellum becomes active. But the sperm cell is incredibly light. Almost all the cytoplasm is gone. The only thing that is there is a nucleus and a modified lysosome called an acrosome. I'll point that out here momentarily. And at the base of the flagellum, a large mitochondria. However, there's not a lot of space there to store any energy, and therefore it's taken up from surroundings, okay, as an energy source here. Furthermore, there's these are actually fatty acid derivatives, prostaglandins. Prostaglandins, there's a lot of different prostaglandins in the body. Some of them, they have variable types of roles. They're sort of like hormones. For example, there is two types of prostaglandins that mediate pain sensation. And one of the things that aspirin and ibuprofen, what they do is that they inhibit the two enzymes, COX-1 and COX-2. This is called cyclooxygenase. Cyclooxygenase is what that stands for. But this is the enzyme that converts a particular fatty acid into a type of prostaglandin that interacts with nerve cells to give you the sensation of pain. And so what the aspirin does is that it inhibits these. Therefore, that fatty acid is not converted. So that's one type of prostaglandins. But these prostaglandins are really interesting because they are produced by the male, but the target is the female, okay? And what they do is that they lead to contractions of the uterus. Okay, now the uterus is further up from the vagina, but the sperm has to move from the vagina into the uterus because that's where fertilization takes place. And therefore, they're peristaltic contractions that they're squeezing the sperm upward, okay, the semen upward, because that's still too long of a way for sperm cells just on their own power to get there, all right? So that's one of the functions of prostaglandins. Prostate gland. Okay, this feeds into the urethra, and it balances pH. Okay, the vagina normally is acidic. just like our stomach is normally acidic, and that is a protection against bacteria, okay, bacterial infections. But sperm cells are very much highly sensitive to pH, and therefore this here contains a buffer which elevates the pH in the vagina so that it doesn't kill the sperm cells. Also has ingredients that activate the sperm. Now, up to this time, the sperm cell, the flagellum, is not active. It isn't until it is mixed with secretions from the prostate gland deposited in the vagina that it then becomes active, and then the sperm cell is moving. The vulvourethral gland, this operates, its secretions is actually during sexual arousal. It's not, and it's before ejaculation, because this is the material that goes down the urethra, because the urethra in males, the urethra is both a passageway for the reproductive system and for the urinary system. In females, the openings are separate. Okay, they're two separate openings. They're close together, the two separate openings. So since urine goes through here, and very often urine is on the acidic side, so this here is neutralizing the passageway before the sperm ever gets there. Okay, and also it is a secretion that adds lubrication. Okay, that's the major function of the vulvourethral gland. Okay, so taking a cross section through testes, this is what they look like. This is probably not human, this is probably rat, but nonetheless it has lots and lots of seminiferous tubules. And you do a cross section to the seminiferous tubule, this is what it looks like. In fact, they're pretty much, many of them are packed together. Now where meiosis begins is on the outer periphery. And as the cells, as we progress from meiosis 1 to meiosis 2, these cells are pushed inward, okay? Eventually, in the middle of the tubule, this is where the sperm cells will mature, and they're simply pushed by growth pressure into the epididymis, where they're stored. So they're stored in the epididymis until ejaculation, all right? So this is just showing the progress is going through here. I'll come back, it has a figure right there. So what happens with spermatogenesis is that, first of all, we start out with actually a stem cell, and it's diploid stem cell. And when that diploid stem cell divides, one of the daughter cells remains a stem cell, and the other one becomes a primary spermatocyte. So those stem cells are called spermatogonia. Okay, spermatogonium is singular, spermatogonia is plural. And so they're diploid, okay, two sets of chromosomes. The primary spermatocyte is also diploid. Now, these are moving from here inward. So our spermatogonium is right here at the basement membrane. Well, actually here, okay, on the outer periphery of the tubule. But when they divide, that cell that is closest to the periphery remains a spermatogonium, whereas the other cell further in will differentiate into a primary spermatocyte. Then when this undergoes meiosis 1, it's the primary spermatocyte that will undergo meiosis 1, and those cells will move in. We now have two secondary spermatocytes. Secondary spermatocytes, these are haploid, but their chromosomes are still doubled, consisting of chromatids, all right? Then we have meiosis 2. Each one of those will divide, and these are spermatids. So they, once again, are haploid, and the chromosomes are single now, okay? Consisting of just the centromere and two arms of a chromosome, like here. Then we have a period of differentiation. So this here, spermatid, is not the finished product. What happens is they differentiate into spermatozoa, or sperm cells. Now this is the same cell, spermatid, sperm, okay? They're same cell. It's just that it's undergone differentiation. which involves losing most of its cytoplasm, growing a flagellum, and at the anterior part of the sperm cell is a modified lysosome, okay, containing digestive enzymes. And that is then the mature sperm cell. Now, there's other cells in here. Go back to this figure. It's a huge cell. In fact, it's all the way up to here. Is called a Sertoli cell. Okay, now the Sertoli cells, they have cytoplasmic attachments to these growing spermatids, and also secondary spermatocytes, even the primary spermatocytes. And they're adding material, usually in the form of RNA, to control their differentiation to these cells. They're also the ones that are taking up the cytoplasm that's being withdrawn as these spermatids develop into sperm cells. Yes?
What is the modified lysosome called?
Acrosome.
And is that the part like underneath the...
It's at the very beginning, up here.
Oh.
Acrosome. We'll come across it here in a moment. Acrosome contains digestive enzymes. Okay, so the sperm maturations, I've already said, we lose a lot of the cytoplasm, develops flagellum, and modified lysosomes fused together at the head here. The rest of this in here is just nucleus. So this modified acrosome is going around the nucleus, because the nucleus fills up all that space, and so this is sort of like an inverted cup that goes around the anterior part of the sperm cell. That's the acrosome. And then they're called sperm cells now, and they're pushed through the center of the seminiferous tubule into the epididymis where they're stored. Now, if ejaculation doesn't take place, these sperm cells have a limited life. They're not there for a long time. They will eventually, if they're not ejected, they will be broken down, and the materials will be recycled. Okay, now in males, this is a continuous process. Okay, spermatogenesis is going on all the time, and there's a lot of seminiferous tubules here. So typical male produces about 3 million sperm cells a day. They're relatively small. Okay, now this spermatogenesis itself is controlled by hormones. So once again, we're coming back to hormones, and in fact, it's hormones under the control of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary that lead to, at puberty, to the maturation of the male sperm system. So what happens at this time, and I'm not sure what it is that triggers the hypothalamus to start increasing the amount of gonadotropin releasing hormone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone, you just need to know it as GnRH. Okay, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And once again, this is from the hypothalamus, and those neural secretory cells, they're the ones that produce it. They release it into a capillary that has carries this hormone to the anterior pituitary through a portal vessel, a very short portal vessel, because they're real close together, and there's a capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. This will bind to the cells that have the proper receptor, and it'll lead those cells to release 2 different hormones, and these are tropic hormones. Remember, tropic hormones are hormones that control release from one endocrine gland, and they control the actions of another endocrine gland. Yes?
So just to confirm, you said that GnRH is released by neurosecretory cells into a capillary. Where does it go after that?
Yeah, it's right here. Okay, so here's our neural secretory cells. This is the hypothalamus. This down here is the anterior pituitary. So it releases the hormones, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, into this capillary bed right here. And that capillary will go into an artery that's very, very, not an artery, but a portal vessel. Doesn't go too far. It's real short. And then it breaks up into another capillary bed, because what is a portal vessel? Portal vessel is a vessel that's between two capillaries. Instead of being between a capillary and the heart, which could either be a vein or an artery, okay, depending. All right, so then this leads to those, and it's these gland cells in the anterior pituitary, they produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. This is then released into the general circulation, and so they'll go everywhere in the body, but the only cells that have receptors for these two will be in the testes. Okay? And this leads to maturation of the reproductive system. I'm not going to go into details about how that happens, it's a little complicated, but it also causes the gonads to start producing androgens and estrogen, okay, in different proportions than what happens in females. Both males and females produce androgens and estrogens, but not in the same quantities. And also they will operate differently. Also, the adrenal glands will produce some sex steroids as well. And so these will start increasing at this time, and this leads, and of course, what do steroid hormones, how do they work? They're hydrophobic. They bind to receptors that are in the cytoplasm. They then become a transcription factor, moving into the nucleus, binding to control regions of genes, leading to a change in gene expression. And obviously this is what's happening at puberty, is a lot of changes in muscle mass in males and in the maturation of the reproductive system. Yes?
Both females and males have follicle stimulating
Yeah.
hormone.
Yeah. Estrogen is important for your bones. So males have estrogen too, but in smaller amounts. One of the reasons females are more prone in old age to osteoporosis, loss of bone mass, is because their estrogens go way down after menopause. Okay? Yes?
What increases the GnRH?
As I said, I'm not sure.
Oh.
Yeah. Something changes in the hypothalamus, and I'm not sure what the trigger is.
And then
Okay.
the hypothalamus is the one that produces GnRH?
Yes.
And then as it increases, then that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that then leads to an increase in release of these hormones. Yes.
And so, just to be clarifying what Bonnie said, all of these are in both males and, sorry, the right side is in males and females, the GnRH is only in males?
No, here we're just talking about males.
Awesome.
We're talking about males. This is because I'm just saying, we'll get to the females in a moment. And you're gonna love females. Okay? They're really, that's gonna be quite a story. All right, but the males are pretty simple, okay? Because we only have one X chromosome, and that Y, it's pitiful. Anyhow, okay, so this increases. Then, after maturation, we still have to control the rate of spermatogenesis. So we still have the hypothalamus stimulating gonadotrophin releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary is releasing both luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. And what are the targets in the male? There's another type of cell that's in the testes, in between the seminiferous tubules. Okay, so Sertoli cells, they're in the seminiferous tubule, but between the seminiferous tubules are Leydig cells. And these Leydig cells, that is the target for luteinizing hormone. So what that leads the Leydig cells to do is they produce hormones, androgens. Okay, the most important one of which is testosterone. Okay, testosterone, there's several forms of testosterone, and there's a few other androgens as well. We don't need to go into details on them, but the testosterone is the main androgen. Okay, and what is the target of that? Well, for both follicle stimulating hormone and testosterone, the target is the Sertoli cells in the seminiferous tubules. And it's the Sertoli cells that are controlling the stem cells, spermatogonium. Okay, and so this leads to spermatogenesis. Okay, but there's also another target for the androgens, other than just the Sertoli cells. It is the hypothalamus. and the pituitary, anterior pituitary. And that effect is inhibitory. So as these androgens get too high, then that switches off the hypothalamus, switches off, well, it really doesn't switch it off. It lowers their activity so that our luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone go down. And so this is negative feedback up here, and it's feedback loop. This is positive feedback. And therefore, this is like a thermostat keeping the rate of spermatogenesis at within homeostatic bands. Doesn't go too high, doesn't go too low. Because as soon as this drops, then that drops too. And if it drops, then we release the stimulation up here, and we increase the amount of luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. And so it's a feedback loop that keeps everything in equilibrium. Yes?
So androgens are the causation of those two lowering and their
No.
activity, or is it vice versa?
Okay. Androgens have two targets. Sertoli cells that speed up spermatogenesis. They also have an inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So if you inhibit these, then these are going to go down too. If these go down, that's eventually going to go down. And if this goes down, then the inhibition up here is released. And therefore that will start going up.
Okay.
So it's keeping everything pretty equal, okay? Pretty equal. And that's the way it is. It's set in the hypothalamus and so forth. Okay, so that's the male. Now let's look at the female system and egg production. Here, the process of meiosis to produce an ovum is called oogenesis. Oogenesis, and there's going to be some of the stories I'm going to throw out because I need to toss some stuff. And now this is much more complicated than in males. And make sure everyone has this. It's the move to the next slide. Okay, now in mammals, most animals other than humans, the females go through what's called estrus. This is not true of humans. We're the weird ones. Okay, so with estrus cycles, sexual receptivity by the females is limited to very specific seasons. Very specific seasons. Breeding seasons. That's quite different. And also the lining of the uterus. The lining of the uterus. Now what is important about the uterus is that if pregnancy takes place, that's where the fetus is going to be embedded. That's where it's going to develop. The placenta is in the uterus. Okay, and the lining of the uterus is called an endometrium. Okay, so in preparation for pregnancy, prior to in these breeding seasons, the lining of the endometrium builds up, becomes highly vascularized. That is, a lot of blood vessels move into that area. And if fertilization does not take place, then all that build-up material is simply absorbed. Okay, it's broken down and it's absorbed back into the body. That's different with humans. Humans have something that is called a menstrual cycle. And for one, how it's different from an estrus cycle is that in humans, female sexual receptivity is not limited to any time of the year. We don't have seasons, okay? It's there all the time. How that evolved? It's a good question. We don't know. And furthermore, the endometrium, and once again, we have no explanation, evolutionary explanation of why that happened to humans, we don't know, is that instead of being absorbed once a month, it is just simply slept off. And so this is the menstrual period that females have every month, about 28 days or so. And so that's the lining of the endometrium, which has a lot of blood vessels and blood, and that is just simply lost every month. Furthermore, this menstrual cycle has cyclic changes in not only the uterus that goes every month, but also in the ovaries. And it's called an ovarian cycle. And we'll look at that, and the uterine cycle. So there's both of these. The uterine cycle is the monthly buildup of the endometrium, And if pregnancy does not take place, then it is sloughed off at the end of the period. But there's changes in the ovary too, okay, that lead to ovulation, and I'll talk about that here momentarily. First of all, look at the structure, just like we have in the male. I'm not going to go into all the details with the labia and external part, because I'm more interested in just only the internal parts here. Is that there, of course, the vagina, and the whole function of the vagina is simply as a receptive organ for the penis, and that will receive the sperm. Then beyond that is the uterus. This is a function of the uterus. As if pregnancy takes place, that's where the baby will be. The opening to this is called the cervix, and usually that opening is produces most of the time a lot of mucus, and it's very, very small. Okay. Now, once we get pregnancy and there's a fetus in here, at childbirth, this here will dilate tremendously. Okay, but for now it's relatively small. And then, and there's just only one central vagina, one central uterus, and on each side is then the oviduct. The oviduct is also called the fallopian tubule. Same thing. Okay, and at the end of the fallopian tubule, sort of at the end, it sort of funnels out. Okay, funnels out, and it sort of goes around part of the ovary. Now, the ovaries are suspended in the body cavity by some sort of connective tissues, we call them ligaments, but there's no direct connection between the oviduct and the uterus. Unlike in males, there's a space, fluid-filled space between them. So you have the oviduct that goes, sort of fits around it as a funnel, but it doesn't have any direct connection to it, all right? So that's the female system. And if you look at it anteriorly, then once again, these are the ovaries, there's a pair of them. And the endometrium is the lining of the uterus, and cervix opening to the uterus. Okay, now what happens with oogenesis in mammalian females is that it begins before the female was ever born, when she's still a fetus. Already meiosis begins. So in the developing female fetus, there is an embryo, is that there will be produced oogonia. Those are special germ cells. I've been calling these germ cells up to now. And at this stage, she will produce all of the oogonia that she'll ever have in her life. They're already produced.
So, like, is the oogonia produced by a germ cell, or is it the germ cell itself?
There are germ cells that produce the oogonia, okay? And then the oogonia, they will divide and become primary oocytes. Mitosis. And already all of the oogonia that the female will ever have in her life are there, okay? And then with primary oocyte, will undergo meiosis 1. Actually, it begins meiosis 1 up to prophase 1 and it stops. Okay, so already meiosis of all these possible future egg cells, they have already started meiosis and they stop there. Okay, and they stay there. They're surrounded by the homologs or analogs of Sertoli cells that are called follicle cells. So it forms what's called a follicle. So the follicle contains follicle cells, and this is called a primary follicle. Okay, primary follicle. And so it is an oocyte that is in prophase 1. Okay, what are the events that happen in prophase 1? Okay, what's a real important distinction of prophase 1 meiosis? But that happens in all prophages. What is distinct about this, different than mitosis?
Chromosomes are paired up.
Homologous chromosomes are in synapses. Okay, they're paired. They're paired, and they stay that way. Okay, and so around this, there will be follicle cells, usually just one row, and that's the way it is until puberty. These cells are in prophase 1 for about 12 years or so. Okay, then once maturity sets in, puberty, then what will happen? Now, there's more to the story, and on the next slides, I go into a lot of details. I'm going to skip those details, all right? I just want to say this, that beginning at puberty, it's primarily follicle-stimulating hormones that will stimulate these, the growth of these follicles. And about 6 months or so before the period, the monthly period that an oocyte would be produced, 4 months in advance, a bunch of these will start maturing and they'll become secondary oocytes. Most of them die. Most of them die. But at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, at the beginning of the month, there'll be only one follicle that will continue. Okay? So most of these follicles never go anywhere. All right, so then what we have here is that this will, the mature follicle, which will be pretty big. You know, I'll show pictures of that in a moment because these primary follicles are real small, but by the time we reach the monthly cycle, this follicle will be real big and it will have several rows of follicle cells around it, okay? And there will just be one, usually just one. Sometimes there might be 2 follicles that will mature to produce eggs, and that's where you get fraternal twins. Okay, not identical twins, fraternal twins. Okay, so this will then start complete meiosis 1. And the division is highly asymmetrical. Most of the cytoplasm goes to 1, but this here was originally the primary oocyte, was diploid. Now, the resulting cells are, of course, haploid. The larger cell is called a secondary oocyte. The other one is first polar body. Usually this will disintegrate, but sometimes as we go into meiosis 2, this may divide. And this is where your book, or your mind tap, said we resulted in 3 polar bodies. Most of the time there's just 2. Okay, most of the time there's just 2. All right, now once this goes into meiosis 2, it will proceed immediately. Okay, once we have this division, it'll proceed immediately into meiosis 2 and will be arrested at metaphase 2. It stops. That's when ovulation will take place. Okay, with ovulation, what happens is that this follicle breaks open and it releases a bunch of follicle cells as well as a secondary oocyte. We still don't have an egg. So what's ovulated is a secondary oocyte. Ciliated cells are in the mouth of that funnel part of the uterus, or the fallopian tubes, and these beating will draw this secondary oocyte into the oviduct. All right? Okay. Now, this is what I'm going to skip. Okay, a lot of detail there. But I just wanted to point this out, and these are numbers you don't have to know. Before birth, the female has about 7 million primary oocytes. By the time she reaches puberty, most of them have died. Starts out with just only 300. And then eventually, how many of them might be ovulated in her lifetime? Only about 450 to 500. Most of them are lost, okay? So you don't need to go into the details on this. You don't need to know the numbers. And also these numbers you don't need to know. Okay, this is just more detail, but once we reach the menstrual cycle for that particular month, what is being ovulated or growing is this, okay? Primary oocytes, very, very small. But by ovulation, has a lot of, this right here is the secondary oocyte. And that is what is ovulated, is the secondary oocyte. All right, now with starts this, once again, this is other information you don't need to know. Okay, you don't need to know this, all right? Whole point here is that we have, under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates certain of these follicles to develop. In the end, only one follicle will be the primary follicle. That will go to ovulation. Then, what is ovulated is a haploid secondary oocyte. So all this detail here, you don't need to know about. But still, the development of the follicles are under, I do want you to know that that's under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone. Okay? Luteinizing hormone doesn't come into play here yet. And, yeah, this is more information that you don't need to know. Except for this, okay? At the beginning of the month, we have one dominant follicle. And at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, toward the middle, about day 14, there is a surge in luteinizing hormone. Now, up to this time, now, what cells have the receptor for follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, are the follicle cells. The follicle cells are the ones that have cytoplasmic connections to the oocyte, and therefore controlling what's happening to the oocyte. Up to this time, those follicle cells have no receptor for luteinizing hormone. But then they will, about day 10 to 14, they will produce the receptor for luteinizing hormone. And there is a surge mid-menstrual phase, high surge of luteinizing hormone. Within 24 hours or so, this primary follicle we have ovulation. And that is due to the luteinizing hormone. So first of all, we have an unequal cytokinesis. Once again, this is with the first meiosis 1. And that second, first polar body is not viable. And so what is ovulated is a secondary oocyte about day 14 or so of the cycle, and it is in metaphase 2. And it'll stay in metaphase 2 unless it encounters a sperm cell. If there's no sperm cell, that will never complete meiosis 2. That oocyte will be fleshed out with the monthly menstrual flow. Okay, I said 24 hours. It's rather variable, but after that, luteinizing hormone surge, it's within 24 to 36 hours afterwards that we have that primary follicle, dominant follicle. It looks like a blister on the surface of the ovary, it will rupture and releasing secondary oocyte. And that's called ovulation. Now, once ovulation takes place, there are not only, well, what is left, that follicle is a secondary oocyte and some follicle cells, but there's still follicle cells that are left behind. They will now develop into something called the corpus luteum. There it is. That is the corpus luteum, okay? And it plays a role, as we'll get into here in a moment. So this follicle and its, or the oocyte, secondary oocyte, and some of these follicles will be swept into the oviduct. And fertilization would take place only in the oviduct. Now, what's important here is we've only been seeing the influence up to this time of follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Now, luteinizing hormone. But now this corpus luteum, which was the remains of the ruptured follicle, it starts secreting progesterone, which is also a steroid, okay? And I'll talk about what progesterone does here in a moment. Okay, so this is cartoon showing cycle. First of all, we start with a primordial follicle. Now, those will stay that way until puberty is reached, and then every month, some of these will start developing, okay, in waves. And eventually, so this is the primary follicle. These are being stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone, and eventually we'll reach the mature follicle. And as I said, on day 14 or so of a particular cycle, this will rupture, releasing the secondary oocyte. What is left behind will develop into the corpus luteum, which produces progesterone. Now, what's important about the progesterone, during this time, we've also had cycle happening in the uterus, and that the lining of the uterus, starting from day 0, it starts vascularizing, okay, building up a blood supply, okay, a rich area that's rich in blood, in preparation for pregnancy, okay? Now, what the progesterone that's being produced by the corpus luteum is important for is that maintains the state of the endometrium. Now, if pregnancy does not take place, then what happens is this corpus luteum breaks down, because now we have about another 14 days of the cycle left. This will break down, and hence its progesterone levels drop. And when the progesterone levels drop to a certain point, is then it causes blood arteries in the endometrium to spasm and cut off the blood supply. And this leads to the menstrual flow. Okay, complicated, but we'll get there in a moment. So fertilization would take place in the oviduct, and this is it can still store sperm. Sperm can be there for about 5 days after intercourse. And now, if pregnancy, therefore, since the sperm cells can live for about 5 days, pregnancy can take place if it's within 5 days before ovulation takes place. And it's very difficult to time when this ovulation event is. They have certain tricks to try to figure out exactly when it is, because even with the same female from month to month, it will probably differ. Okay, so these numbers, I'm saying 14, day 14, those are averages. Okay, so the secondary oocyte, however, will complete meiosis II if it comes into contact with the sperm cell. So if we have a sperm cell, okay, it has to have the right protein receptors, because the sperm cell has proteins on the surface, on the plasma membrane, on the secondary oocyte, also has proteins that they have to be compatible. And once that happens, that will then immediately, this secondary oocyte will complete. Sperm cell hasn't entered yet. Okay, it just made contact, and this secondary oocyte will then complete meiosis II. It's in metaphase II, and anaphase, telophase is very, very quick. And so one set of chromosomes will move out and become the secondary polar body, which has no role. This now is an ovum, and it already has the sperm nucleus in it, the egg cell. And then we get the fusion of the egg nucleus, sperm nucleus, and now you have the zygote, which is diploid. Okay, so that's the story here. A more technical word for the egg cell is ovum. Okay, and it has a very short existence. Okay, just only maybe minutes before the sperm nucleus and the ovum nucleus fuse together, and you have a zygote. Okay, any questions here so far? Now you're really going to love the rest of the story, because I'm going to go into exactly what hormones are happening during this monthly cycle, because it's much, much more complicated than what happens in males. All right, So fertilization. Okay, this happens in oviduct. And of course that thing isn't feeding. Okay, so where is it getting its nutrition to grow? Okay, to divide. Now, of course, that zygote initially is pretty big, and so when it divides by mitosis, each cell becomes smaller and smaller. By the time you got to the blastula, those cells are real small. But still, they have to have some source of protein or amino acids, some glucose, etc., in order to power their growth and their metabolism. And that comes from secretions that are produced from glands inside the oviduct. And so this will begin its journey. And so down here, it's only a zygote up here. By the time it reaches the uterus and implantation, which is about 6 days after fertilization, then that is already a blastula. Okay, it's at the blastula stage. And what's aiding its movement is the lining of the endo, and this is a epithelial tissue, and those cells happen to be ciliated, and this is what's moving that structure on down here. So by the time we get down into the uterus, it is a blastula. Now, what's interesting about placental mammals is that some of this is called a trophoblast cells. Some of it is called the inner cell mass. It's only these cells that will become the embryo. Okay? All these cells, of course, are genetically identical. They came from the zygote. So they're identical, but this trophoblast cells, that will not become the embryo. They will contribute to forming part of the placenta. Because this is where the extra embryonic tissues come from, is from these cells. Okay? And the follicle cells, they will eventually degrade. Okay? And furthermore, if no fertilization takes place, then the secondary oocyte will go out with monthly flow, menstrual flow. All right. Now, the hormones of this, we still have the same hormones, except for we have one extra hormone that I didn't talk about in the male. Actually, two extra hormones, progesterone and estrogen. Males do have estrogen, okay, but it's not in high amounts like it is in females. But this is still under the control of the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus still will be releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary then is releasing follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And the ovary, the follicle cells in the ovary, particularly the follicle cells, they produce estrogen and progesterone. Okay? So we have a bunch of hormones here, and I'm going to say what their targets are. So what I'm going to do is now go through the hormonal changes stepwise through the menstrual cycle, starting at the end of the last menstrual flow. We're going to start at the very beginning, okay? Very beginning. And I'm going to show here on this, time is going down, and what I'm going to have over here is what's on the first column, what is happening in the hypothalamus. The second column is the anterior pituitary. Third column is the ovary, and the fourth column is the endometrium in the uterus. Okay? So, and the first part of the menstrual cycle is called the proliferative phase, because this is going to be divided up in several phases. So first of all, what we have here, so this is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus at the end of the previous monthly cycle, we're starting a new monthly cycle, is that its levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone are low. So it's secreting it, and the target for those is cells in the anterior pituitary. And so they get stimulated to release, at the beginning, very low levels of follicle stimulating hormone, low levels of luteinizing hormone. These are released into the bloodstream. So they go everywhere in the body, but the only thing that has receptors at this time for follicle stimulating hormone happens to be follicle cells in a follicle that's going to develop. Okay? Follicle cells, so this leads to stimulation of those follicle cells. This time they only have receptors for follicle stimulating hormone, and that leads them to release low levels of estrogen. So it's the follicle cells that are producing the estrogen. Now for each of these, whenever deal with any of the hormones, I always want you to know the source, sometimes the stimulus for their release, okay, under what conditions are they released, what stimulates them to release, and their target, and very specific, a lot of times, very specific target, not just uterus. In this case, target for follicle stimulating hormone are the follicle cells, okay? And then their response. So the target for estrogen is the endometrium of the uterus. This starts, estrogen stimulates cell division, okay? Because the walls of the uterus are going to build, okay? So what I mean by vascularization is a blood supply, okay? So there's arteries that start growing and capillaries, etc. So this is the beginning of the vascularization, building up of the endometrium. Now there's also a second target for estrogen, the hypothalamus, okay? The hypothalamus is estrogen on the hypothalamus stimulatory. So here we're going to have a positive feedback loop. A positive feedback loop. So as estrogen levels start to go up, that produces higher and higher stimulation on the hypothalamus, which increases its production of gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary's release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Okay? So this has higher levels it's producing, which gives a higher amount of follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. So this is all a positive feedback loop. And of course what we put, I'm going to think right here, I'm going to be going to the next screen, so everyone have this. Okay. So that increasing level of follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicle cells to increase the estrogen. And of course, what is the target of the estrogen? Stimulates the endometrium. So this is gradually building up. So the estrogen levels are gradually going up. And of course, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are going up because of positive feedback. The other target for the estrogen, of course, is the hypothalamus. And so that speeds it up yet more. So this is just a feedback loop. And we reach about day 14. Okay, notice that I'm on the screen, I have changed the phase. First part was the proliferative phase, usually about the first 12 to 14 days of the cycle. Now it's ovulation phase, okay? So by this time, this follicle has really increased in size. And the follicle cells not only have receptors for follicle stimulating hormone, but also for luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone, we get about day 14, a high peak, and that is what triggers the ovulation within 24 to 36 days afterwards. Okay, we have ovulation, and the ruptured follicle becomes the corpus luteum. Okay, corpus luteum. And of course, these follicle cells are increasing their estrogen. Okay, so I'm going to the next part, which is the secretory phase. So this corpus luteum, once again, this third column is the uterus, or the ovary. Okay, so it's now has high levels of estrogen that's being produced at this time, but it begins producing progesterone. And this leads to the highest development of the endometrium. Okay, the highest development of the endometrium, and progesterone is important for maintaining that. The estrogen was important for it to grow, but for maintaining it, keeping it in its intact state, that requires progesterone. And now notice here the feedback of estrogen, progesterone together at high levels is it has a strong inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus. Okay, the same hormone, it depends on its levels. Okay, estrogen at lower levels was stimulatory, but at high levels and in conjunction with progesterone together, it's inhibitory. And so the levels of, in fact, they drop precipitously. The levels of follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, drop. Okay. Now the corpus luteum is dependent now. It's dependent on luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is what maintains the corpus luteum. And so as this drops, okay, where am I? Then the corpus luteum starts to degrade. Okay, so the levels of progesterone, estrogen start to go down. Okay, because LH is important for maintaining the corpus luteum. So as the corpus luteum starts to disintegrate, then the levels of estrogen, progesterone go down. And when a certain level, threshold level of progesterone has been reached, then arteries in the endometrium, they spasm, cut off the blood supply, and all the lining of the endometrium, the cells die, and they slough off. And so for about 5 to 7 days, then there's bleeding, as all that material will come from the endometrium down into the vagina and out because of the dropping levels. And then we're back at the beginning of the cycle, because now our estrogen, progesterone are real low, and that removes the inhibition on the hypothalamus, and we're starting a new cycle. Yes?
Did you say how long the ovulatory and secretory?
It's just a few days. Ovulation is just a few days. The secretory phase is then the rest of the time. Okay? And then so what we have here is then we're back at the beginning of the cycle that we have just real low levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so the menstrual phase, 3 to 5 days, okay, at the end of the cycle. And what happens here, we have enzymes that are released. These are actually metalloproteases, and they're breaking down the extracellular matrix that's holding the lining of the endometrium together. And furthermore, we have blood supply that's been cut off. And so as I said, those arteries, they contract so that we don't have a lot of blood coming into there, and this causes necrosis. Those cells die. Furthermore, there's other types of prostaglandins here. Okay, not the same that were produced by the males, but they're still hormones that are derived from fatty acids. And these are inflammatory, so there's inflammation. And this is sometimes what causes cramping of the smooth muscles during a period. Okay, it's mostly due to those prostaglandins. And usually it's the outer 2/3 of the endometrium that is lost, okay, at the end of this phase. And it involves about, not a whole lot of blood, but this is a loss of iron for women because this blood, and that contains hemoglobin, okay, with iron in the hemoglobin. This is why women can sometimes be iron deficient because of this situation. And as I said, in other mammals, including other primates such as chimpanzees, our closest relatives, they have estrus cycles, and all this material is preserved. Okay, it's just broken down, reabsorbed into the body, and recycled. Yes?
Is that other 1/3 of the endometrium like always in the uterus?
Oh, no, it's usually the muscle area there.
So like it stays there?
It's right there, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You can't get rid of it completely.
Yeah.
You still have to have a uterus.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, that's there. Okay, and so this is, now, I made it look like these levels of the hormones, that they follow a certain pattern. They do. Really, at the very beginning, there is an elevated level of follicle-stimulating hormones, and that's really what stimulates the follicles to start developing. Then it drops. Our luteinizing hormone is relatively low, but once we get close to the ovulation phase, both of these have a peak. But it's primarily this peak in the luteinizing hormone that leads to the ovulation. Okay? And luteinizing hormone is necessary to keep the corpus luteum going. And this is what's happening. So actually, you see the levels of estrogen is rather more complicated than what I sort of gave you, but it was only after ovulation that our progesterone, the blue one, really goes up. And this is what's happening to the endometrium. And as luteinizing hormone starts to drop, then that relieves the corpus luteum from surviving. It starts breaking down, and our progesterone goes down, and that's what leads to the menstrual period, okay, at the end there. Okay, so now what happens if pregnancy takes place? So our blastula, which has that inner cell mass that will become the embryo, and those trophoblast cells, it will embed into the lining of the endometrium, and they'll start building the embryo, and eventually it'll produce a placenta. Now, what's important here is that the embryo itself starts secreting another hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, okay? Only after it has embedded here, okay? So that's about 6-7 days after fertilization. Now, what is important about this is it takes the place of luteinizing hormone, okay? Remember, by this time, luteinizing hormone is dropping, and that is what is necessary for maintaining the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces the progesterone, which keeps the lining of the endometrium there. Now, we don't want the lining of the endometrium to slough off now, because if we slough it off, you lose the embryo, okay? So, the function of human chorionic gonadotropin is that it stimulates the corpus luteum to stay there. Our luteinizing hormone goes down, okay? But now it's this hormone produced by the embryo itself that maintains the corpus luteum, keeping progesterone high, keeping the endometrium there, okay? All right? Pregnancy test, this is what they find, okay? Because the embryo is producing this hormone, it's in the woman's blood, ends up in her urine, and so the urine test, they're detecting this. There's no way that the woman is not pregnant if this particular hormone is there, because it's produced by the embryo, not by the woman. Okay, yes?
This is kind of random, but I heard that if like a male takes a pregnancy test and it's positive, and that means they have like prostate cancer or something like that? Like it's an indication
I
of that?
don't know anything about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that.
They're just gonna take
That might be, sounds a little, no.
I don't know, I read it online, so.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I'm real skeptical of most of the stuff I read online, unless it comes from a good source, you know, and who knows? Yes?
On the slides it says 12 days after fertilization for the blastula embedding in endometrium, but
Well, it's variable,
okay.
yeah, and so you look at different books, different sources, they'll say that, yeah. Okay, all right, so now, after this happens, would the woman be able to get pregnant again during her pregnancy,
No.
the second time? time. Why?
Because there's no, ovum for fertilization,
Why not?
because the, I'm not sure.
'Cause there's
Explain to
already,
me,
like-
why would there be no more developing follicles? Because normally every month there's a follicle that develops. You get ovulation every month. Ovulation stops during this pregnancy. But why?
Just the,
The inhibition,
What?
oh, the inhibition of, like, the hypothalamus GnRH.
Okay, but why is it not producing?
cause there's already a zygote.
What's suppressing it? Why is it not releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone and not releasing and stimulating the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone? They stay low. But why? What hormone is high?
Oh, estrogen,
What?
estrogen. Oh,
Progesterone.
Progesterone. Progesterone. Your birth control pills are some form of progesterone. Okay, usually they happen to be artificial, but they're not natural progesterone. It's called progesterone. Sometimes these pills, anticonception pills, some of them also might contain estrogen, really, because there's many varieties out there, but they all contain progesterone or some form of it. Because high levels of progesterone suppress the hypothalamus. And if the hypothalamus is suppressed, then there's no gonadotropin releasing hormone to stimulate the anterior pituitary. If the anterior pituitary is not stimulated, then there's no luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone, which are necessary for follicles to develop. Okay, so all that is suppressed. Question?
Kind of like, is that how like, if birth control is progesterone, is that like, kind of like tricking the body into thinking there's a baby?
Yeah,
So then
because
it's not.
you're interfering with this hormone cycle.
Oh.
Yeah, by keeping progesterone high, or something that looks like progesterone to the hypothalamus.
So is it just the progesterone that's inhibiting the hypothalamus, or is the estrogen also inhibiting?
Well, it's primarily the progesterone, or the progesterone. But they do have pill mixtures where it's both of them, and a lot of times those are a little bit more effective, but one of the reasons they go for the progesterone, which is a form of, artificial form of progesterone, is because there's less side effects. Okay. But they also, with the progesterone only pills, you really need to make sure you take the pill, okay? Because they don't suppress for very long, okay? And if you forget, then pregnancy could end. But they have both varieties. But usually with the estrogen, it is more side effects. Okay? All right, I'm going to skip this part. We're not going to worry about how the baby develops, all
I
right?
have a question.
Yeah.
So when they do placebo pills, is that why the endometrium is shed?
Well, they put the placebo in there during there's several ways to do this. If you have a set of pills that you have to take a pill every day, you still, originally, this is when they developed this back in the 1960s, they still allowed for the menstrual flow, all right? So they put dummy pills in there for those days, during which the endometrium can be slept on. Okay, so those are dummy pills. And then you go back to the real.
So that's just swab off the endometrium? Like if you don't,
Yeah.
if that doesn't happen, what's going to occur?
Okay, now they have other types of things where they have injections. Okay, they put it under the skin, and some of those injections are continuously releasing progestin for continuously, so the woman usually doesn't have a period. Okay, and so there's all sorts of things like that. And furthermore, this is relatively long lasting. They have patches that last for a whole month. Okay, the pill form, you have to take it every day. They have these rods that you inject just under the skin, and I don't remember for how long those
A
last.
good 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, it's for quite some time. And there's other injections that can last for several years. Okay.
Don't the rods really damage, or can they damage your liver? I've heard that.
They could,
that-
yeah,
that
because almost everything has
may-
some side effects, yeah, and and as far as taking care of males, you know, the best thing is just whack it off. You know.
Isn't it like male birth control?
No.
Oh, there is male
No,
birth
that's
control.
not one of them. You know, vasectomy.
Isn't there male birth
Oh.
control pills now?
There
Yeah,
is-
they've developed,
Yeah,
yeah.
there is. And, you know, right now, for males, it's mostly condoms, all right? And, but they do have a male pill that they're trying to develop. But, I don't know too much about it. Vasectomies, they're permanent, okay? That, they work, quite well. But then if you plan on having children in the future after vasectomy, it's not gonna happen, okay? Now, I wanna get into something else here before I stop. Time is it? Okay, yeah. Sex determination. Okay. This is actually determined at several different biological levels. All right? For one thing, when we call it the genetic sex. The genetic sex is whether or not what chromosome composition you have. Okay? But I want to point out here that the genetic sex does not necessarily always determine the phenotypic sex. There's other things that happen. Okay? So here, it's X or XY. Now, one of the things that's on the X chromosome, okay, now there's something else. First of all, in the embryo, when gonads form, initially the gonads are indifferent. They're neither testes nor are they ovaries, okay? They're neither. Unless an individual has a Y chromosome, then this Y chromosome, okay, this is about 6 weeks, they're indeterminate. And there's two sets of tubes in the embryo. One set called the Wolffian ducts, other set called the Mullerian ducts. And if the Wolffian ducts are stimulated, then the internal piping will become male. If the Mullerian ducts are what get stimulated, then the internal piping will become the internal female reproductive parts. All right, so both of these are there. So there's the potential to become either one, male or female, okay? Because both, it depends on how the hormones have to handle them, right? So everyone get this, because I'm going on to the next one. So on the Y chromosome, there is a gene called SRY, okay? This is what leads to a male production program, okay? So this will becomes expressed, SRY, produces a protein which binds to, this is a protein and it goes into the nucleus of cells in the Wolffian tubes and in the gonads, especially in the gonads. Let's go to the gonads, yes. And that changes gene expression, okay? So this switches on male-forming genes. And the gonad, well, cells in that gonad will differentiate into Sertoli cells, which are male, okay? Those Sertoli cells, okay, they will lead to the formation inside of the gonad of seminiferous tubules. And the Sertoli cells produce another hormone called anti-Mullerian hormone, or AMH. The target of AMH is the Mullerian tubules, the Mullerian ducts. And it leads them to degrade. So that now you only have the Wolffian tubules, Wolffian ducts, yes.
What's with the accent mark? The Mullerian.
What?
The term Mullerian, what's with the accent mark?
It's German.
It's German. Ooh.
Okay.
Okay, Mullerian, okay? That's, instead of Mullerian, but in German it's Mullerian, okay? Yes. Okay, and yes.
Sorry. So in the beginning, like at week 6, the Wolffian ducts and Mullerian ducts are
They're both there.
They're both there, and then it just depends which one gets stimulated.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going, first of all, what makes it a male,
Okay.
okay? If it has that a Y chromosome, that carries SRY.
Uh-huh.
SRY stimulates the gonads to become testes.
Yeah.
Once they're testes, those Sertoli cells produce anti-Mullerian hormone, which bind to the Mullerian duct receptors, and the Mullerian ducts will degrade. Okay, so they won't be there anymore. Furthermore, we get Leydig cells in the gonads, in the testes now, about week 8. These are the ones that produce androgens, testosterone. Okay, testosterone. And the target of the testosterone is the Wolffian ducts, and it allows them to develop. If there's no testosterone, these would degrade automatically. If there's no anti-Mullerian hormone, the Mullerian ducts will develop automatically. So the program is already, default is to become female. Default is to become female. Just only what interferes with that is the SRY gene that's on the Y chromosome. Okay, now furthermore, for the phenotypic sex, so here I've talked about the genetic sex, whether you get XX, XY, gonadal sex, whether or not the gonads become ovaries or testes, but whether the external genitalia become male or female is the phenotypic sex. And this is due to another form of testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, DHT. Okay, and so this is necessary for tissues that are undeveloped to become the prostate and the external genitalia. If there is no dihydrotestosterone, then the external genitalia will develop as female. And that's what we mean by the phenotypic sex. Okay, now let's look at what happens for females. Yeah,
So when we say that, we're only talking about like appearance, right?
what's that?
Like we're only talking about like appearance, right?
Appearance, yeah.
And
And also a function.
in this case, if like a female that has like XX, genetic sex.
I'll come to that. Let me get through here, and then I'm going to show you one case here where there's something to go wrong, okay? So let's go down the female sex, okay? XX, there is no SRY. Therefore, there are other transcription factors there, but without stimulation, the Mullerian ducts will develop into the female system. Okay, that's default. Okay, and in the absence of testosterone, there's no anti-Mullerian hormone produced because the gonads become ovaries. Gonads become ovaries. It's the Leydig cells in here that are producing the AMH, anti-Mullerian hormone, and if that's not there, then the Mullerian tubes will develop. And the Wolffian tubes will simply degrade. Okay, these need testosterone in order to develop. But in the absence of high levels of testosterone, there's testosterone there, but not real high, not typically of males. And there's no AMH, and therefore the Mullerian tubes will develop. And dihydrotestosterone, it doesn't get produced at high enough levels, so the external genitalia will develop as female. Okay? And so the default is to become female in mammals. Okay, and do I have enough time? Everyone have this. I'm going on one last, I only have time to cover one particular syndrome. It's androgen insensitivity syndrome. Okay? This is actually a fault on a gene that's not on a Y chromosome, it's on the X chromosome. So females have 2 alleles. Males only have 1. Okay? And what it codes for the androgen receptor that can recognize testosterone. Okay? So even if we have a XY individual, if they get their X chromosome, and then they'll get their X chromosome from their mom, okay? And if it has a mutation in the gene for this androgen receptor, then the cells are insensitive to androgens, including testosterone. As a result, we have XY individuals. The gonads, because SRY is there, the gonads will become testes. So they will be testes. They will produce anti-Mullerian hormone. They will produce testosterone. but nothing can respond to it. So with the anti-Müllerian hormone, the Müllerian tubes degrade, but the Wolffian tubes can't sense the testosterone, so they degrade too. So they have testes, internal testes, but no piping, no internal genitalia. Okay? And so there's no functional genitalia on the inside, all right? Nothing develops. And a lot of time the external genitalia, because the androgen, because that dihydrotestosterone, it is an androgen, and it has to bind to the androgen receptor. It can't be detected, okay, because the receptor is defunct. And so, in the absence of being able to sense, they are producing dihydrotestosterone, but nothing can sense it because of the androgen receptor being faulty, and therefore the external genitalia will sometimes be ambiguous, or it's definitely female, okay, even though they are XY males. Okay? Yes?
So there's no Wolffian ducts, no Müllerian
Yeah.
ducts, and no
So-
testes?
So there'd be no oviduct, there'd be no uterus, there'd be no vas deferens, no prostate gland, none of that stuff on the inside.
And no testes either?
Testes are there, but they're internal,
Oh,
because they need testosterone, or probably, I think they need dihydrotestosterone, sensing those for the testes to descend.
So-
They start in the embryo, up in the body cavity. And before birth, they will descend into the scrotum. Okay?
oh, so they're external and they
When
move.
there's dihydrotestosterone.
Okay. And
But
the
this
wo-
can't sense them, so they remain, they're testes, but they do not descend.
So is the like urinary system or the females like completely separate from?
Completely separate. Okay, so the urethra in females opens just a little bit anterior to the vagina. And it's still within the labia majors and minor, it's still there, but it's a separate opening. Okay, males, they share the urethra as a passageway there. Okay? I think I will stop here. I'm going to go into embryonic development, but there's another syndrome, and I don't remember all the story to it. I won't tell it, okay, because I wouldn't look it up. And I might tell you about this other condition, but it's a condition, let me get my details straight on it, and I'll tell you about it on Thursday. But it's something similar to this. First of all, the individual develops as a female, or as children, they think they're female, but when they reach puberty and hormone levels of dihydrotestosterone go up, they all of a sudden start changing into a male, which really surprises mom and dad, by that time. It's rare, but it does happen.
So people with this syndrome are phenotypically male, but,
Phenotypically
I'm sorry,
male?
genetically male, but phenotypically female.
Okay, so yeah, with this, they're phenotypically female,
But
but
genetically
But
male.
the gonadal sex is male and chromosomal sex is male. Yeah. But a lot of this, there's other conditions that, that interfere with the sex development that you can have. And these people will never have children, there's no way.
Is stuff like this tested for at birth, or like how do you find out if someone has it?
Well, you look for the gene. You have to, like, the gene, you know where the gene is.
So is it automatically tested for when you're born, or?
I don't know if they automatically test for it. That I don't know. But it would be easy enough to test for it if someone wanted it, because all you have to do is take it, you don't even have to go to the genitalia, you can take swabs out your mouth, that's where X chromosomes will be there too. And they have primers to target that. And they know what the mutation is, so you just sequence it.
And then will Will the secondary sex characteristics develop as female or as male in this case?
Well, they have high, well, yeah, they're developed as female.
Even the second?
Yeah, because they don't, because, even though they're producing high levels of testosterone, the cells can't detect it. Because it's the androgen receptor that's wrong. Okay, so even with other parts of the body that are influenced by testosterone, they still not having the proper androgen receptor, they won't respond to testosterone. So, yeah. Okay.
So what traits would they show later on in puberty?
There'll be breast development. They won't have as strong, usually not male type of hair pattern, and also, so they're developing the feminine direction. Yeah. Okay. Mhm.
So the Wolffian ducts are what generally turn into the testes?
No.
No?
They would, the Wolffian tubules will become like the vas deferens, epididymis,
Oh, okay.
ejaculatory duct. Okay.
And just in this case, like the Wolffian ducts are still present, but they're just not responsive.
That's right. Well, they're not present, they'll degrade. See,
The-
they're there at the very beginning,
Oh, okay.
but after a certain period of time, they degrade unless they are stimulated by testosterone. But they can't see the testosterone, because the androgen receptor, which they bind to, the testosterone binds to, it has the wrong shape, they don't fit together.
Oh, okay, so the
So the
receptor
Wolffian
doesn't.
tubules will degrade, and so they'll have no internal reproductive parts.
Oh, what stimulates the formation of the Wolffian ducts and the Mullerian ducts?
What starts them?
Yeah,
They just show up at a certain stage.
okay.
Yeah, there's no, they both develop. It's just part of the unfolding of the gene pattern, okay, with differentiation. So, and that's a story that gets to be complicated because we do know that already in the egg, the secondary oocyte, those follicle cells have placed certain messenger RNAs that were produced by the follicle cells, that they're tethered at certain parts around the plasma membrane. So when we get the first division, then and they're not just equally distributed. The first cell has certain messenger RNAs that will then be translated into proteins that were determined by the follicle cells. Okay, and that sort of sets the stage for changing gene expression in a stepwise manner as the embryo starts developing. And so the production of both of those tubules in mammals, they're part of that program.